And welcome to the 25th meeting in 2020 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Before we get down to business, we have apologies from Alistair Allen, who joined the committee just last night. So George Adam is attending as his substitute. Welcome back, George. We've missed you. The first item on our agenda today is to take evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance as part of our pre-budget scrutiny. This session will also include evidence on the Budget Scotland Act 2020, Amendment number 2 regulations, before we formally consider the motion. I welcome Kate Forbes to the meeting. She's joined today by Scottish Government officials Jugie McLaren, who's the Deputy Director of Public Spending, Scott Mackay, who's the Head of Finance Coordination, and Fiona Tom, who's the Head of Income Tax and Reserve Taxes Unit. And I invite Ms Forbes, if she wishes to do so, to make a short opening statement.
Thanks, Convener. I'll speak briefly because we've had quite a budget-heavy 2 weeks, having already given statements to Parliament on both the autumn budget revision and the UK delayed budget. The autumn budget revision is, of course, a second opportunity for Parliament to scrutinise the funding commitments that we have made in responding to the crisis following the earlier additional summer budget revision. It was published on the 24th of September and details the second phase of the response. As the committee will know, it's a snapshot of a developing funding position which brings the total Scottish Government financial response to COVID to over £6.5 billion. Committee will know that that includes £4 billion at the summer budget revision and £2.5 billion here. It allocates £2.55 billion of COVID-19 and other funding changes funded through £2.4 billion of consequentials, £142 million of reprioritisation and £30 million of capital reserve drawdowns. £1.84 billion of Barnett consequentials are allocated to health and social care, reflecting that the crisis is first and foremost a health crisis, and we have committed to pass on all health-related consequentials in full. So the net increase to the Scottish budget is £2.4 billion. Now, that leaves just over £500 million of COVID-19 resource consequentials formally unallocated of the total £6.5 billion that we have been guaranteed to receive from the UK Government this financial year. And the residual Scotland Reserve position is currently £220 million, of which only £70 million is resource. The unallocated funding is being used currently to address the substantial current and anticipated COVID-19 funding requirements, which are already embedded within our budget position. And funding for those commitments and pressures will be formally added in the spring budget revision. So to reiterate my comments in the Chamber, as things stand, there is no headroom. While I have welcomed the UK Government funding to date, I've continued to press the UK Government for additional fiscal flexibilities to support the COVID-19 response appropriately. Convener, I've already mentioned my concerns about the decision to scrap the autumn UK budget. It's extremely concerning, and having sat in front of this committee last year to discuss the same issue, I'm sure committee members will join me in recognising how difficult that makes our own budget process, including the vitally important role of scrutiny. When it comes to our income tax outturn figures, I wrote to committee last month regarding HMRC's publication of outturn figures on Scottish income tax. The letter highlighted that the net reconciliation effect is £309 million reduction in our funding for next year, and I set out the calculations behind that figure in the letter. My predecessor has previously written to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, he did so in September last year, to discuss the fact that the current borrowing and reserve powers in the fiscal framework are insufficient to deal with the volatility that is inherent in the operation of income tax, and I'll continue to press that point. But I will stop now and look forward to taking questions on any of these areas or other areas of interest from the committee.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. In relation to the UK Government funding guarantee of £6.5 billion of additional Barnett consequentials related to the COVID-19 emergency, the autumn revision confirms that there's remaining, as you say, just over £500 million in the consequentials. Can you tell the committee what considerations you'll take into account when allocating this financial resource. Now, obviously, I'm aware these matters were covered to some extent in the statement and questions that you gave to Parliament yesterday, but I think it's important for the public record to hear from you further as part of our committee evidence, and other colleagues may have follow-up questions in these areas too. Over to you, Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks very much. And it may help if I explain a little bit about the background to the guarantee, because I think it will help with subsequent questions. So in July, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury confirmed, and this is unprecedented, that he would provide a guaranteed funding floor to help us with our forward planning on the budget. And, whilst perhaps the media attention is often focused on the unconstructive dialogue that sometimes takes place between governments, that was actually a very welcome result, because it meant that we could plan for the future, not just retrospectively when it came to our budget position. Now, for example, we have we have forecasted the costs for maintaining our transport networks between now and the end of the financial year. I know, for example, that I need to hold at least £200 million as a bare minimum for our transport networks. Those costs are likely to increase over the next period of time. There's also money set aside for COVID-19 related pressures and loss of income in education. There's also forecasted costs relating to the self-isolating payments and for those that are shielding. And there's a number of other areas. And when it comes to that funding guarantee, it means that when Treasury makes announcements, when the UK government makes any announcements now that generate consequentials, we are informed that those consequentials are already captured in the funding guarantee that was announced in July. So in other words, it's unlikely right now that there will be any additional funding coming, because any new announcements that generate consequentials have already been captured in that July announcement. And that's why there's a tension within this budget revision, which is we cannot formally allocate all the spending, because some of it is anticipated forecasted costs in the future. And as members will know, the budget revision is a retrospective process which updates the budget formally. And for that, you will need confirmed figures. So at the moment, I'm in dialogue with Treasury on how the Barnett consequentials that would be expected to flow to the Scottish Government reconcile against the funding floor, because my hope would be that we will reach the end of the funding floor, and that means that all future announcements that generate consequentials provide additional funding, which we can then start to use and to commit to new and emerging costs. So our current indications, and sorry this is a long answer, but I think it's important to set out the detail. Current indications are that the Barnett share of funding allocations to UK departments is now around the level of the guarantee, which would mean that further announcements give rise to further consequentials. But we do need that clarity. We need a reconciliation against all the announcements that have been made to date and the consequentials that arise from them against the funding that was confirmed in July, because there has been quite significant difficulty in tracking the individual consequentials arising, particularly where initiatives are demand-led. So if you take the self-isolating payments as an example, that is demand-led in England, which means it's very difficult for the UK government to confirm what consequentials might arise. Now, that makes it very difficult for me, with no headroom at all, to design self-isolating payments ourselves, knowing that it may or may not be covered by the consequentials that emerge. And so the last point to make is that this year is obviously unprecedented. Next year's budget will be unprecedented, but the funding needs far outstrip the funds that are available. And that's why it's extremely challenging to design demand-led schemes when you don't know what the funding cover will be arising from consequentials. So realise that's a very long question, but I think that point around funding guarantees from the UK government was largely overlooked in the summer, and it is welcome.
Okay, that was helpful. It probably anticipates some of the question I was going to ask you in terms of a follow-up, but I think it's still worth boring down into a little bit, Cabinet Secretary. As I understand it, and from what you said, any additional funding from England for England will not generate additional funding for the Scottish Government until the Barnett formula implies that the total amount received should be greater than the 6.5 million guaranteed funding floor. And tracking that is something that the advisor has told us there is potential confusion around as to what Scotland is actually due in terms of Barnett consequentials. Therefore, I just wonder, have you and the Treasury now confirmed that you can now spend up to that full level of the 6.5 billion guarantee? And what arrangements are in place to let you know if you can spend beyond that figure? What discussions have you had with the Treasury Ministers? What agreements have been reached on this? And crucially, how would you propose to communicate any further information to Parliament?
Okay, so that characterisation is largely accurate, which is that the current ongoing discussion between my officials and Treasury officials is to try and get clarity on a reconciliation of all announcements that have been made to date generating consequentials and how they track against that funding guarantee. Because I have a sneaky suspicion that the announcements to date are starting to exceed the funding guarantee. In other words, the announcements that generate consequentials have generated sufficient consequentials to exceed that funding guarantee. But we won't know that at the moment. Treasury are saying that they will try and confirm that in November. But of course, between now and November, there will be initiatives, schemes that we've got to design. I mean, on today of all days, how we support localised lockdowns when we don't know if the localised lockdowns in England have generated additional consequentials to the money that we've already received. And of course, the other question is when there are announcements, is that coming from reprioritised funding at Treasury that therefore doesn't generate consequentials, or has it generated additional consequentials? So what I'm trying to say here is that the funding guarantee was welcome. It helped us to independently plan over the summer. The difficulty now is that I suspect we have got to the limit of that 6.5 billion, and it's highly likely that there are going to be additional consequentials. The problem is I won't know until November at the very earliest. And in the meantime, we've got to proceed with localised lockdown support, with self-isolating payments, with continued support for our transport networks. So it was a positive initiative, but it needs updated. And what we need is that reconciliation of announcements to date and how they track against that funding guarantee.
I get that, Cabinet Secretary, and it's obviously complex, and it's a detailed and challenging area that we're operating in here. But if the government's finding it challenging, so is the Parliament finding it challenging to know what's going on. So, what commitments can you give to make sure that as much transparency as possible can be in the system as far as this committee is concerned and Parliament?
Thanks, and sorry I missed that last question from your original question. I'm open to any suggestions that Parliament or the committee have for additional transparency. And obviously there have been calls on publishing lists of spending requirements and costs. That will be done in the spring budget revision, but I realise that is a number of months away. So if it would be helpful to update the committee on my engagement with Treasury on this point, then I'd be very happy to perhaps write a letter when we have additional information. But if the committee has another view and the information that they would like me to provide, then I'm very open to looking at how we do this transparently. Our approach to date has been to try and set out transparently, which is why we have the summer budget revision. And if there's more that we can do, then I'd be happy to oblige.
Okay, thank you for that, Cabinet Secretary. Murdo, do you have a question in this area?
Yes, thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. It's really just a follow-up to the Convener's question, so thanks for the clarity you've provided. And What I was really interested in understanding a little bit more around is the allocation of this 537 million that the convener referred to, which, as you've said, is not formally allocated. In your statement to Parliament yesterday, you said of this sum, every penny has been allocated against health, transport and economic support measures required by the COVID response. But in the response you've just given to the convener, you've phrased it slightly differently. And what you're suggesting is that you have made forecasts of likely cost pressures and in effect penciled in against this money how that 537 million might be allocated. So can we just be clear? I mean, you said yesterday the money has been allocated, but you're suggesting this morning that in effect that's only been done on a provisional basis. So which is it?
So it might be helpful if I gave a direct example. So if you take transport, for example, we have very reliable estimates and forecasts from the various transport operators of what it will cost to keep transport moving between now and the end of the financial year. We have that for rail, we have that for bus, and we have that for light rail. So we can be pretty confident in what the costs will be. Now, as with any costs and with any budget, there's risk attached, because if we go into a greater lockdown restrictions, those costs will rise. If we change, for example, the regulations by which transport has to adhere to, then we will, again, the costs will rise. So we've got relatively reliable costs for transport. So it's incumbent on me to make sure that I can continue to support the transport networks, not just to this point in time, looking retrospectively, but between now and the financial year. Now, those costs are not in your budget revision, but those are real costs. And I can't just live on a wish and a whim that there may be additional consequentials coming and spend all I've got right now. I need to hold those costs against the costs we know of in transport. And that's why there's a tension in saying that any future costs are, to an extent, forecasts, but they are real forecasts that will have a real impact. I could also use examples within local government. Hopefully, in the next few days, I'll be able to announce full details of the package of support for local government in terms of fiscal flexibilities, but also the lost income scheme. And again, something like a lost income scheme, we have got a ballpark figure for it, but it's demand-led. It will be application-based. So I've got to have sensible, wise, informed, prudent budget cover for that. And the same goes for the example I've given you on the self-isolating payments. I've got to have budget cover. Now, this has got to be intelligent budget cover. This is not money that's sitting in a rainy day fund, which we may or may not use. And that's my point, that whilst you won't necessarily see it in this budget revision, because a budget revision is retrospective and has to be based on fact, those are all real costs. And the point I would strongly emphasise is that these real costs outstrip the funding that is currently available. And that's why I hope that we'll soon be in a position where the consequentials generated by UK government announcements exceed the guaranteed funding floor, and we can start looking at the other costs that we haven't yet been able to fund.
Okay, I mean, thank you. That's a very helpful answer in terms of giving us greater clarity. But if I can reference then back to the convener's last question around parliamentary scrutiny, I mean, clearly you are already aware where you have penciled in against this money how it's to be allocated. Is there more you can do to share with this committee and with Parliament how these funds are likely to be addressed, rather than us having to wait until February before we find out how all that money has been formally allocated?
I'll give that very careful thought. The caveat to all of that is that we are operating in a very, very fluid situation. And one of the challenges, and I'm not looking for any sympathy, but one of the challenges right now in this job is that things are moving and changing at such a pace. If I use the transport example, and we'll obviously hear over the next few days what further restrictions there might be, if any, that instantly changes almost overnight the funding required, because it may be that localised lockdowns need additional support. It may be that the transport companies need additional support. And so in one sense, any figures I were to provide would probably be out of date as soon as there was a change in terms of what we're managing. So I'm very happy to take that away and to give some very careful thought to what additional information I can provide the committee with. But I would do that with the heavy caveat that it would be a snapshot in time in a very, very dynamic situation, in a very fluid situation, and also at a time where the November, I hope it will be November, the November reconciliation will give us the clarity we need on how much of the UK government announcements is actually new money and how much of it is just incorporated within either previous announcements or is from reprioritisation.
Thank you for that response. I mean, I think it would be helpful to members of the committee to get some more detail around this, because as I'm sure you will be aware, and all colleagues, all parliamentarians will be aware, we constantly have requests from constituents looking for us to ask for more support, whether it's for tourism, hospitality, football clubs, wedding venues, soft play centres. Everybody's looking for more money, and to get an understanding of what's been penciled in, I think would be very useful. I wonder, Convener, if I could just ask one more question, which is on a slightly different area, which is the question of the Scotland Reserve.
Murdo, just before you go there, I think Angela had a supplementary in this area. I'll come back to you immediately after. I think Angela had a supplementary about the consequentials issue. Am I right, Angela?
Yes, Convener, I just have one short question for the Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, just for absolute clarity, are you currently spending in areas where you have yet to receive consequentials? In other words, are you putting money out the door, but you're still waiting on the cheque, hopefully arriving in the post?
Absolutely, on 2 points. The first is where we have taken a distinctive approach. So the most obvious example of where we've done that is the distinctive package of business support measures, the Pivotal Resilience Fund, the Hardship Scheme, and also the £350 million Welfare and Wellbeing Fund that I established as part of our response at the very beginning to make sure that community groups were resilient, the third sector could continue to support communities. That was based on in our own budget. It wasn't funded by additional consequentials. It was distinctive. But the second area is the point how we are currently operating at risk, which is to have to proceed with initiatives and schemes without having the clarity of whether this will come from additional consequentials or not. And the biggest risk one, the best example of that is the self-isolating payments, where I don't know as we speak right now what consequentials there might be confirmed for that, because it will be demand led. So therefore I've got to proceed designing a scheme, funding it with an element of risk, because we will do that, we're committed to it, but I don't have the clarity and the cover from the UK government, and we won't have that until November.
Can I ask Alec Rowley, is yours related to consequentials, a supplementary as well, before we go back to Murdo?
Yeah.
Alec, okay.
Yes, thank you. Can I just pick up very quickly on that point? I mean, the Cabinet Secretary says it's a pretty fluid situation, and she talks about demand-led budgets. But my experience, demand-led budgets is that when they run out, they run out. What kind of strategic planning and strategic thinking is going into where monies are being directed and spent? Because what you've said so far is almost like, your job is simply to just keep throwing money at issues, but we do know the money will run out. So are you strategically thinking about the medium term, the jobs crisis, etc., when you're spending this money?
Just to clarify what my job is to make sure the money doesn't run out. My job is to make sure that we can continue to honour the commitments that we have made. So when it comes to something as critically important as self-isolating payments, my job is that even if it is demand-led, to ensure that there's adequate budget cover, because the purpose of that scheme is to ensure that we don't disincentivise following the rules, that we provide the support to enable people to follow the rules and the guidelines. So that's where, Alex Rowley picks up on a great example of the point I've been trying to make, which is that with all these schemes in a very fluid situation, I need to make sure that we have budget cover for the areas that are vitally important. And there's clearly huge demands. And Murdo Fraser talked about the requests from his constituents, which I understand in full, because all those requests from his constituents and other people's constituents end up being requests to me. So there's a lot of demand at a very difficult time for business support, welfare support, to ensure that we have funding for the health service, to ensure that we manage any second waves, to ensure that we've got winter cover. These are all significant demands, and they're not just always in the millions. Sometimes they run to the billions. So that level of demand and what I'm trying to manage in a very fluid situation. And my responsibility is to make sure that there is cover for important announcements like the self-isolating payments or otherwise.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Murdo now. Sorry, Murdo, for that interruption, but I think you probably understand why.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Just one more question on a related but slightly different angle, which is looking at the Scotland Reserve and the balance in that. At the start of the year, according to Table 1.7a in the Autumn Budget Revision paper, the Scotland Reserve balance at the start of the year was 433.7 million. It's forecast to increase to 758.7 million. And I just wondered, of that total, how much of that might be available for deployment in terms of spending?
Yeah, so and I may bring in one of the officials specifically on the reserve. In terms of the commitments made the updated position of the Scotland Reserve is based on the provisional outturn and subsequent commitments that were made in the Scottish budget and then the summer budget revision. And the balance drawn down in the autumn budget revision is £30 million. In terms of the residual balance, you're right in stating, I think you said £759 million. Any additional underspends when it comes to our capital in particular will result in net additions to the Scotland Reserve. But of that overall amount, far less is resource. Most of it is capital and FTs. But I wonder if Scott wants to come in with just a bit more information about what is in the reserve at the moment.
Okay, Scott, over to you.
Sure. So that the figure that Murdo Fraser is referring to there is a combination of the 537 million of as yet undeployed consequential funding and the remaining balance in the reserve, which is round about 220 million, of which 70 million of that is resource. So and with the rest capital, a mixture of capital in it and financial transactions. So the majority of that 750 is the figure that we've already been discussing as being available for application at the spring budget revision.
All right, thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Murdo. Patrick.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the Cabinet Secretary. I wanted to pursue questions in the same area about this unallocated resource, which we'll hear more about in the spring budget revision. First of all, just about how the process works within the Scottish Government, because you've discussed how this issue is being discussed between the Scottish and UK governments, but within the Scottish Government there must already be a process for telling individual departments or public bodies how much of the as yet unallocated money is going to be available to them. You've already told the Parliament, although not formally allocated here, remaining consequentials are already being deployed, and you've just told Angela Constance as well that this money is already being spent. So individual departments and public bodies must surely have been told by you how much of this is available to them. Why, if you're able to tell them, are you not able yet to tell us? And can you also explain, of the currently allocated part of the consequentials, does that all cover the same portion of the financial year across all spending lines, or is that going to vary from subject area to subject area?
Thanks. So on the first question, in terms of how the process works, we don't go out inviting bids for unspent money, because when it comes to any organisation that's budgeting, your budget looks at what has been actually spent, your actuals, as well as your forecast spend. And to use another example, we have provided funding for employability skills. Now, we don't just provide funding for a limited period of time, let's say a few months. We've got to make sure that that is funded right up to the end of the financial year. So it's looking back as well as looking forward to provide that guarantee. But going back to my conversations with the Treasury at the beginning of summer, or late spring, beginning of summer, the consistent message that I was making, which I made in Parliament, was that it was very difficult to plan ahead beyond the next UK government announcement, because we could not have confirmation and we could not guarantee that there would be funding available right up to the end of the financial year. And so we were already holding significant cost pressure. We were already holding, whether that was to do with transport, which I've already mentioned, whether it was to do with the anticipated spend on health over the winter period. These are costs that have been on the books that I'm aware of for quite a while. And the challenge for me was to try and identify budget cover to allow the health service to plan ahead, or to allow transport operators to proceed. So those were already cost pressures. And when the UK government made its funding guarantee, it meant that I could say to the NHS, those cost pressures which you've identified, I can reassure you now that there is some budget cover for you to go ahead and plan accordingly. And the same goes for transport operators. I'm just using those two examples. So it's not a case of holding money and inviting people to bid. It's a case of being fully and acutely aware of the spending pressures across the Scottish Government and across the public sector and across society, and as and when money is available, being able to meet those costs, which is why I say that every penny is committed. I could commit double what we have there. I mean, it would be very easy for COVID-related costs to exceed what we have available, probably threefold or fourfold. So that's why the notion that there's anything sitting there uncommitted is nonsense. I think that the biggest bulk of the spending guarantee that the UK government made relates to transport, because they too are dealing with significant pressures on their transport system, particularly on rail. We don't have that breakdown yet of precisely what figures in the spending guarantee are linked to what announcements that have been made, which is what I'm pressing for. In terms of the second part of, do you want to come back in?
Carry on. Back in a moment.
Well, second part of your question, which I scribbled down and now can't read my own handwriting. Could you remind me what your second question was?
I mean, it was really about the certainty that Scottish government departments and public bodies have. If you are already spending this money, which you told Parliament you told Angela Constance you are a few minutes ago, if you're already spending it, the bodies, whether government departments or other public bodies who are responsible for it, must know what they have. So at what point can you give Parliament the information that you've already given to those spending bodies?
Yeah, so not to sound like a broken record and not to be unhelpful, but the spring budget revision is the point at which we can give that perfect clarity. But in advance of that, I can give reasonable certainty and clarity to various public bodies, but it's a very, very fluid situation. So that's why I'm trying to plan as far ahead.
It's a fluid situation and that it's very challenging. And you and I both wish that Scotland had greater control of the overall financial envelope that's available to government. But within the context that we're working at the moment, it just seems to me that some of what you're saying doesn't quite tally with what's happening. You said, for example, that you want to make sure that public services know that the money will not run out. And you've given the example, local government, for example, where financial flexibility and replacement of lost revenue, you're going to have some announcements over the coming days. That's very welcome because there are services that are not yet reopening because of that financial pressure around lost revenue. But you've also emphasised transport. And we know, for example, this situation of making sure that money is constantly available has not been the case. SPT has been given emergency funding in respect of the subway in Glasgow, for example. That already ran out a week ago. It only covered up to the end of September. And if they don't have confidence now that that funding is going to be continued, they will face a financial black hole which will threaten not only the subway services, but other public transport services right across the whole Strathclyde Partnership for Transport region. So when will SPT, as one example, have confidence that the emergency funding which has already run out will be extended and that those services will be safeguarded?
When I have the budget available to do that. So what I'm not saying is that there's unlimited funds that can cover all our pressures right now. What I'm saying is that we have used the funding that is available to us to meet pressures as far as possible, to prioritise public services as well as the transport sector where we can. But like I said, I could easily spend 3-4 times the budget that we have available. So we are not currently able to meet every single penny of cost that I can identify, which comes back to my point that I made at the committee this morning and I made in the chamber, that there is no headroom available, but we are using our funding that we have available to meet the identified costs. Not all of the identified costs, because there isn't sufficient budget to do that.
You said there's no headroom, but you also said 200 million of this unallocated resource is penciled in or earmarked for transport. So you must already have an idea of how much of that will be going to a provider like SPT.
But it will also be going on the rail service. It will also be going on light rail, as you're identifying. It will also be going on buses. It will be going on ferries, and it will also be going on where we've got, for example, the Highlands and Islands air service. So
I appreciate that. You can't wait until spring to find out.
Okay,
of
Patrick.
course not. That's where we want to provide as much clarity as possible, but there isn't unlimited budget to meet all of the costs.
Right, we'll need to move on, Patrick. Sorry. Jackie Bailey.
Convener, and good morning to the Cabinet Secretary. Could I ask about reprioritisation of existing Scottish budget lines first? And I see from the table in front of me, there's 50 million of underspend in heat networks and another 50 million of underspend in the Scottish National Investment Bank. Could I ask her how these underspends arose and, in effect, what has not happened as a result of this?
So I think in both of those cases, my understanding is that it relates to capital that hasn't been able to be spent because work was suspended over the period of lockdown. So there were very similar underspends and reprioritisation that emerged in the summer budget revision, which directly related to work not proceeding. Now, none of that has been wasted because all of it has been redeployed into other areas around our response to COVID. So if it's relating to FTs, we've used some of that when it comes to welfare. If it relates to capital, we'll have used some of that when it came to the £230 million sort of return to work capital recovery package.
That's helpful to know, and I wonder whether you could give us a list of how that money has been redeployed to the committee in writing. I'm just very concerned that, obviously at a time where fuel poverty is rising, where businesses are struggling, that money is being lost to those budget heads. I appreciate the reallocation, but there's a genuine overall concern. Can I turn to maybe a small matter, but certainly a big matter for my community, and that's the question of the Whitehall transfer of £6 million for the devolution of the debt advice levy. I don't think that money has been allocated yet, but I would welcome confirmation on that point. The real gap, I think you would agree, is in terms of frontline advice services, particularly for advice workers in both local authorities and the voluntary sector, at a time where we are facing quite a substantial unemployment crisis and therefore an impending debt crisis on top of that. What action can she take to ensure the money gets out the door quickly and actually goes to frontline advice workers?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm very happy to add that into a letter of response on precisely what we've done around debt advice. Right now, when it comes to welfare support and advice services, we're continuing to seek to ensure that there is sufficient budget there. Clearly, there are greater demands on all of our service, particularly around things like PACE, when it comes to employment, unemployment, redundancy, which she mentioned. But in terms of the details of the debt advice service, I think it'd be more appropriate probably if I asked Jamie Hepburn, who's responsible, to provide additional details on the service right now.
Thank you, that would be very helpful. And my last question, Convener, is about employment support, because in the tables it suggests that 90 million of Barnett consequentials have been allocated for employment support, and that's welcome. I'm curious to know how much has been allocated from the Scottish Government's existing budget lines to boost that, because as she'll know, the scale of the jobs crisis we're about to face is quite enormous. It's like nothing we've ever faced before. And I think the real prize is not in what the UK government do, or indeed what the Scottish government do, in isolation of each other. To maximise the amount of input we need to have, they need to be working together. So I'd be curious to know what specific discussions have been had between both governments about ensuring that employment support actually reaches those that need it most.
Yeah, so of course, in terms of the question, which was funding source, it's, we have, as outlined here, there's £142 million of reprioritised funding, as well as Barnett consequentials. So in terms of any spend, I can't trace that back to precisely where it comes from. That's not the way our budget works. But the £90 million that she identified is resource funding for employment support and training costs. And that includes the announcement around a job guarantee for young people and a new national retraining scheme. So some of that will be using some existing means of support and redeploying it. Some of it will be new money. Well, the majority of that 90 million is, of course, new money. But in terms of our wider package of support for unemployment and training costs, some of it will be ensuring that the current existing schemes that we have in place are refocused on helping people deal with the impact of COVID-related redundancies, and some of it is brand new.
Could I ask a quick follow-up, Convener, because I'm just slightly concerned that I think the package announced by Fiona Hislop was for £100 million. So it suggests that £10 million has been reprioritised. And I am very nervous, given the scale of the job loss we're going to face, that money has simply been repackaged. I think we need to increase the scale of the resource available, and I wonder what plans the Cabinet Secretary has to do just that.
Yeah, and to confirm, the £100 million that was announced is new money. So it was announced just after the Chancellor's statement back in whenever it was, July, and some of it was taken from the fact that we didn't replicate the equivalent SDLT LBTT cut that the UK government did, and it meant that there was some resource available which we used for employability. So part of the funding for the £100 million guarantee came from the not replicating the equivalent cut in LBTT.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, John Mason, please.
Thanks very much, Convener, and maybe to change direction a little bit, Cabinet Secretary, I'm looking at your letter to us, or to the Convener, on 23rd September, as well as the Scottish Fiscal Commission letter of the same date. And to start with, around the forecast for income tax, I mean, the forecast error, we were hearing figures of 500 million, which sounded a bit scary, but it's down to 300 million now, which sounds a bit better. Can you say anything about these forecasts and why there's a difference? And I mean, I think part of the problem is that HMRC, to start with, just didn't have the figures available. But it looks like they do now. So hopefully, would I be right in thinking we'll be more accurate in forecasts going forward?
So in terms of the change of the £309 million, obviously both the income tax revenues and the BGAs were lower than forecast, and it's the gap between the two that matters. So in terms, and it's worth saying again that forecast error does not reflect the performance of income tax, it reflects the forecast error made when the budget was initially set. And whilst any questions around forecasting are for the SFC, I think what we can see, and they've identified themselves, is that one of the biggest challenges was around historical data. So ensuring that they have a historical outturn data for Scotland means that they've said themselves that will not be a feature of future forecast errors because they are now building up that historical data. But the biggest challenge for the Scottish budget, and the reason why there is that uncertainty and volatility, is because we have two different forecasters, and that increases the risks of large reconciliations. And ultimately, reconciliations can be due to differences between the SFC's and the OBR's forecast methodologies. And that means that a run of negative reconciliations might be followed by a run of positive reconciliations in the future. Reconciliations ultimately shouldn't be confused with how tax receipts or the economy is performing. They are a normal part of the fiscal framework process for all taxes. The key is being able to manage that risk and that volatility, which comes back to the need within the fiscal framework to have sufficient borrowing powers for forecast error. And I am, maybe relieved is the wrong word, but I'm relieved that the 309 million is a lot closer to the borrowing limit of 300 million than previous suggested reconciliation figures.
Thanks. And the SFC make the point that when you break down the forecast errors, theirs is about 83 million and the BGA is 207 million. 83 million seems quite an accurate figure, actually. It's given the size of our budget. Would you agree with them that they've been pretty accurate?
I mean, it's difficult for me to comment on the accuracy or otherwise of forecasters. We've got to work within the figures that they provide, and it's not for me to say that they're accurate or inaccurate. But certainly that is the margin of error with a build-up of historical outturn data will most certainly make it a lot easier for the SFC to forecast. And that margin of error that you've mentioned is I think, reasonably good.
Thank you. Now, another point the SFC have made, and our advisor.
So is this your final point?
If you want.
I'm just seeking clarity. That was all. On you go. Sorry.
I've got two more questions actually, if that's okay.
Push on then. Yeah.
Thank you. one of the points that the SFC and our advisor were making is about the difference in the number of taxpayers for income tax. And that seems there's a difference of about 33,000 from what had been forecast. Now, one of the suggestions is that's because a number of people have incorporated and therefore avoided Scottish income tax. Can you make any comments on that? Is that your understanding that that's a problem?
So I think that when it comes to the tax base, it is one of the reasons why there can be significant difference in the two different forecasters in the forecast that we have. And if you look at the reconciliations that we are working with just now, if you look at the figures underneath it, we know that receipts grew by £640 million in the year under consideration between 2017 and 18 and 18-19, and the number of Scottish income taxpayers increased by 0.4%. Scottish receipts grew more quickly than in the rest of the UK, 5.9% versus 4.2% in the rest of the UK. That was driven by strong growth in receipts amongst high income earners, in particular higher rate taxpayers. So why am I saying all that? Well, because one of the challenges is making sure that the forecasts don't disadvantage Scotland on the basis that we have a different tax base, that we've got a different makeup of taxpayers. There's different representation, a different percentage in the higher and additional rates in both parts of the UK. Was that what you were trying to get at with the question about?
That's helpful. I mean, it's an issue that probably I think the committee will go back to in future because I find it interesting. But my final point, and again, the different tack, more like I was asking you yesterday, was about the delay in the UK budget. I mean, I think the UK would feel that because things are so uncertain, they just have to delay the budget. So I just wondered if you could, what would your response be to that argument?
Things are uncertain. I mean, there's no question that things are uncertain. We've spent the first half of this committee session talking about how fluid the situation is and how challenging it is to budget. I don't in any way dispute the fact that things are challenging right now, but I have to, by law, set a budget for next year. I have to, by law, set income tax rates before the beginning of the financial year. I have to, by law, come to set a balanced budget, which takes into account the revenue raised from tax, as well as how it's going to be spent. So in that context, when the majority of the revenue for that budget comes from the UK government, suddenly, overnight, the majority part of our revenue has been thrown into question, and there are questions still about how accurate the figures will be to allow us to set a budget. Now, that's one part, and that's the block grant adjustments and how accurate they will be. But if you come onto the other side of the balance sheet in terms of tax, we were able to, for example, put in place 100% rates relief for retail, hospitality and leisure, because the UK government took a similar approach and it generated consequentials. It isn't affordable for us to continue that relief without the UK government doing the same. Now, if the UK government only announce an equivalent change in their own budget, which could be late March, and I have got to go ahead of the UK government, say at the beginning of next year, then we are unable to come to an informed position on tax, without knowing what the UK government will do. And the same goes for LBTT, where we already saw that changes on SDLT we had to respond to immediately because of the impact on the housing market. So we have to be, whether I like it or not, very responsive to tax policy by the UK government, whether I like it or not. And we are dependent on the block grant adjustments that are confirmed at the UK government's budget. So it goes without saying that our budgets are linked considerably, and I'm dealing with the same level of uncertainty that they are, but with fewer levers to manage that uncertainty.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Alexander Burnett, please.
Thank you, Convener, and I note members to my register of interest. Just a couple of questions. If I can start with Employment Finance Secretary. You must be equally disappointed that fewer people are achieving sustained work under the Fair Start Scotland scheme than people expected. And so I can ask, with a declining tax base, how concerning is this failure and why do you think it's not working?
Well, I would take issue with the premise of that question on Fair Start Scotland. Fair Start Scotland is essential to helping and supporting people into work, and never more so than right now, where we are seeing a rising number of people that are unemployed. That cliff edge of furlough coming to a conclusion at the end of October is only going to exacerbate the situation. And the replacement scheme does not incentivise employers to keep people in work. So Fair Start Scotland has never been more important, but it can't be the only thing that we do, which is why we have over the last few weeks announced a number of different schemes to support people into work, whether that is through a retraining scheme or through the job guarantee that I've already mentioned. So in terms of the tax base, I am seriously concerned when I look beyond the end of October at how we are going to continue to keep people in work, when the Chancellor has deemed it acceptable to determine what is and isn't a viable job, not understanding that some people have viable jobs, they just can't do them because either the business isn't there or they're required by law to shut down.
Thank you. That wasn't really my question. I think we all agree the scheme is essential and how important it is, especially in these circumstances. My question was that, given that fewer people are achieving sustained work than expected, why you think this particular scheme is not working as intended?
I think it is working as intended, and we've extended Fair Start Scotland contracts for a further 2 years, and have also added a further £2.35 million for the Parental Employability Support Fund, so that we bring in-year investment considerably higher to support people into work. And I think Fair Start Scotland is an important element of the overall employability package that we've put together. So I fundamentally disagree with the underlying premise to your question.
Okay. I think if your figures that you're expecting it to have worked are lower than what the Scottish Fiscal Commission were expecting, there's clearly a miscommunication there between your expectations and their expectations, but maybe that's one for them when they appear in front of the committee. So just finally on my other question, and can I move to the other element of business, namely property and business rates? And whilst I totally appreciate your lack of business experience, do you understand why the low percentage error is neither insignificant nor insubstantial?
Well, I can only thank you for sharing your own business experience and enlightening me. When it comes to non-domestic rates, any extension of the relief for next year will be dependent on what the UK government does, because we have put in place £972 million when it comes to funding that rates relief for a year. Right now, because your government cannot get its act together and provide certainty. Of course, it can provide certainty on Brexit, because that will always take priority over providing certainty to the taxpayers and the communities and the businesses of this country. But because your government cannot get its act together and provide clarity in next year's budget, it means that we are left in the position of not knowing whether or not we can extend that rates relief. So I would suggest that if Alexander Burnett cares about the businesses within his constituency, or the businesses that he has, that he should start lobbying his own government to ensure that there is that certainty and that clarity before we hit the cliff edge. And might I suggest that doing what the Chancellor did with furlough, which is to provide the clarity a matter of weeks before it comes to an end, and a matter of weeks after most businesses have started issuing redundancy notices, is not the way to manage non-domestic rates relief.
Yeah, I'm going to move on to Angela, but Alexander, I don't think we need to be rude at this stage in terms of our processes. It's been a pretty reasonable exchange we've had here, and therefore let's just keep it going in that way. Angela Constance, please.
Can I not finish my question? Sorry.
No, I'm going to Angela. I said.
Thank you, Convener. Can I ask our intelligent and insightful Cabinet Secretary for Finance a question about forecast errors in social security? Now, we know these forecast errors, Cabinet Secretary, are small and that they are due to higher eligibility and higher take-up rates. Now, this should not be a surprise to anyone, not least the Scottish Fiscal Commission, as the policy aim around social security has always been to improve the offer and improve take-up rates. For example, the Scottish Government's been very clear that up to 194,000 kids will benefit from the Scottish Child Payment. But on the scale of things, how problematic are forecast errors in terms of planned demand-led budgets? Or actually, are the issues just more bigger and broader and more fundamental around issues about the lack of powers that the Scottish Government has, or in terms of the delay to the UK budget, in terms of the impact that that will have on planning, tax and spend?
Yes, it's challenging managing forecast error within social security, largely because when it comes to income tax, those fall several years later. But social security means that we have to, and it's not just social security that generates forecast error, but there's forecast error that needs to be managed within the financial year, and there's forecast error that could be managed in future budgets. So it is challenging. So the focus up to now has been largely on the income tax reconciliations, and I've already said it's £309 million. But that doesn't take into account the forecast error that emerges from social security as well. And all of that will need to be managed within the borrowing limit of £300 million. And the bottom line is that your reconciliations, unless it falls within that borrowing limit of £300 million, is hard money. It's money that needs to be taken from other parts of the budget. So most governments would borrow for forecast error because they don't want forecast error to reduce their spending power. And spending power is about supporting communities. It's about supporting the NHS. It's about ensuring that we've got welfare support in place. So actually forecast error reduces the amount of money you have to go back out the door to help the very communities, the very individuals, the very households that depend on social security in the first place. So that's where it's a challenge. And it's not something that we necessarily need to wish away. Social security volatility, when it's demand-led, will exist. The key is that you have either the borrowing powers or another means of managing that volatility across devolved taxes and social security.
Thank you for that detailed answer, Cabinet Secretary. I have one final question, Convener, and it is brazenly political. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, given that this week is Challenge Poverty Week, so what does the autumn budget revision do to loosen the grip of poverty on people's lives? And do you agree with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation that the UK Government need to step up and match Scottish Government efforts to tackle child poverty?
Yeah, I mean, Angela Constance raises a critically important question at a time where the risks of poverty are rising because of the challenges that we are facing, because of the rising levels of redundancies. And already this government and our budget was mitigating some of the worst impacts of UK government welfare changes. The very fact that the Chancellor announced at the very beginning of the pandemic that he was going to extend support through universal credit demonstrates that it's not sufficient. And my fear is that unless there is a fundamental change at source in terms of welfare support, we are going to be unable to mitigate all the impact of that at a time where more and more people are going to be dependent on universal credit and on welfare support. If that support is not there, then people are going to be facing a very, very challenging future. Now, we are at the moment continuing to fund those mitigations, whether it's mitigating the bedroom tax or the Scottish Welfare Fund. We, at the very beginning of the pandemic, increased the amount of support available for council tax reduction, welfare support, and I already mentioned the £350 million welfare and wellbeing fund. But those are all sticking plasters. They're important and I support them. But unless you have a consistent, a robust safety net for people that find themselves in poverty through no fault of their own, particularly at the moment, then I fear we face a very, very challenging future for families the length and breadth of this country.
Okay, sorry, I'm now going to move on to Dean Lockhart. I'm going to come back to Alec Rowley after that because I didn't notice that Alec had asked for a supplementary in John's question area. So I'll come to you at the end, Alec. Dean Lockhart, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I would actually like to come back to John Mason's question about the decline in the number of taxpayers in Scotland, because the outturn data shows that the number of taxpayers fell by 4,200 compared to a forecast of an increase of 29,000. The outturn data also shows that the new 5-band tax system is expected to raise less revenue than previously forecast. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, can you give us your views on the factors underlying the decline in the taxpayer base in Scotland and also the decline in revenues being generated by the 5-band tax system? Thank you.
Thanks. Just to clarify, Scotland raised £119 million over and above the block grant adjustment, and that was largely thanks to the decision to move to a 5-band income tax system. So it's important to make that point, that in terms of additional revenue that we have access to, the key is that we raise more than the block grant adjustments, which the 5 bands did. In terms of our receipts, if you look at both at receipts and the number of Scottish income tax payers, both of those increased between 2017-2018 and 2018-19, which is the year under consideration. So income tax receipts grew by £640 million and the number of Scottish income taxpayers increased by 0.4%. And those are both important measures of how well or otherwise our income tax system is working. The receipts themselves, which is ultimately the revenue that we raise for public services, grew more quickly in Scotland than it did in the rest of the UK. And I think I've already quoted the figures, that in Scotland they grew by 5.9% and in the rest of the UK they grew by 4.2%. And that is largely due to strong growth amongst high income earners, in particular higher rate taxpayers.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I probably for another time, but I'd like to come back to some of those numbers, but I think for the sake of timing, I'd like to move on to something else. And it's the forecast from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which has been looking at the significant increase in COVID spending coming from the UK government. And the Institute of Fiscal Studies has recently forecast that the standalone fiscal deficit in Scotland will be in the region of 26 to 28% of GDP, which, as you will know, is unprecedented, and that's double the deficit level for the rest of the UK. I just wanted to ask the Cabinet Secretary, does she agree with this forecast for Scotland's standalone fiscal deficit of the Institute of Fiscal Studies? And if she does, is the fiscal deficit something the Cabinet Secretary considers when making spending decisions and calling for additional funding from the UK government?
I wonder if Dean Lockhart thinks that £372 billion worth of deficit, which is what the UK government is forecast to see over the course of the COVID period, is also unprecedented, and whether or not the UK government can afford to operate an independent country in light of that deficit, because it is considerably unprecedented and is a very challenging position. And I think we all accept that the UK government's public finances are going to face a challenging outlook. Now, when it comes to Scotland, he is comparing two very different things. He is looking at Scotland as part of the status quo, and I think in his words, he is saying that Scotland as part of the status quo, which is of course as part of the United Kingdom, is unsustainable. And I would actually agree with him, that I think the way that the fact that 70% of our spend is reserved, at least in the figures that he's alluding to, the fact that the majority of tax is reserved and the fact that most fiscal levers are reserved, it suggests that if there's anything that's unsustainable, it's the fact that Scotland is part of a United Kingdom which hasn't seen our public finances managed in a way that certainly we could as part of an independent country. I think I just said 70% of spend. I meant 70% of a revenue raising.
Just a very brief follow-up, if I may. Obviously, the UK level of UK budget deficit is half the standalone fiscal deficit in Scotland, and the UK government is able to borrow in the international markets at very, very low interest rates because of that. But my question, Cabinet Secretary, was, do you consider the level of fiscal deficit in Scotland when calling for additional spending from the UK government? Is that something you monitor and consider on a regular basis? The standalone fiscal deficit is something that is part of your monitoring when you look at the fiscal position in Scotland?
I think that's an illogical question, because you're suggesting that right now, as part of the status quo, as part of the United Kingdom, where the majority of our income is reliant on the UK government. In other words, I have no other means of accessing funding, significant funding, apart from the UK government, with a small amount that comes, a very, very small amount that comes from devolved taxes. So the only means by which we can access funding within the United Kingdom is from the UK government. And in light of that being the status quo, if there's anything that's unsustainable, it's the fact that we are reliant on the UK government. Now, when you look at the money that is the tax that is raised in Scotland, the revenue that is raised in Scotland, and fully devolved spend, of course, every year I am required by law to balance our budget. And the very fact that we've been calling for borrowing powers indicates that we cannot right now present an unbalanced budget. In other words, we cannot right now run a deficit of any significance. So he is comparing two very different things. And if Scotland were to be an independent country, I know that that's something that he would fundamentally disagree with, but we can at least agree on the facts. If Scotland were to be an independent country, then we would take very different decisions.
Okay, take that information that you don't monitor the standalone fiscal deficit. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you, Dean. Alec Rowley, please.
Thanks, Convener. I'm not sure that I know that much about forecasting, other than they're often wrong. It's a bit like saying, with the benefit of hindsight, we should have had a crystal ball. But can I ask specifically, the Cabinet Secretary mentioned that she had enough borrowing powers to be able to address the forecasts that were wrong for the last couple of years. What progress has been made with the discussions with the UK government about the extension of borrowing powers, and specifically borrowing powers be able to offset the deficit? But has there been discussions about increasing the powers of the Parliament around capital expenditure as we plan to try and deal with the tsunami of job losses that are heading our way?
So there has been no progress on the fiscal flexibilities, of which two are the repurposing of capital and dealing with the borrowing limits. There has been no progress on that. I would dearly love to see progress, because I think on both counts it wouldn't cost the UK government a penny, and it would enable us to just be a bit more flexible with the funding and the budget that we have. In terms of forecast error, I go back to that point that if you don't have borrowing with an appropriately capped limit, then you reduce your spending power. So going into next year's budget, when we need to ensure that every penny is going towards the COVID response and economic recovery, if it's being used to plug a gap created a few years ago, not as a virtue of the performance of our income tax, but because of error in the forecasting, that is money that cannot be used for other purposes. And like I said, most governments would not reduce their spending power to deal with forecast error. They would ensure that there is borrowing cover to smooth that curve of error. In terms of repurposing capital, it's a question that I've made. We know that, and Jackie Bailey raised two examples earlier, where capital couldn't proceed at the pace that we forecast it would at last year's budget, and to be able to redeploy that to the areas which are most in need right now would make a big difference.
Okay, Alec.
You know, could I have just one very quick one, Convener, which is back to a point Angela Constance made about poverty. What is the barriers that are stopping the Scottish Government progressing with the child payment, the new child payment? I understand you've said that you'll bring it forward in February for under 6s, but there is a crisis right now. Why? What is the reasons that we cannot bring forward the child payment and start paying it to all parents under 16-year-olds?
So in terms of the Scottish Child Payment, whilst most things that we've been involved with have been delayed as a result of COVID, that's not one of them. It's only, I mean, it has been a delay, but it's by only 2 months, which I think is amazing considering the pressure that government and other public bodies have been under. So we are proceeding at pace to ensure that the Scottish Child Payment will be ready to operate, as he says, in February, but will be open to applications in November. He'll know that there has been some debate and discussion as to whether there could be an alternative scheme to fill that gap, and also whether there's a means of extending the age limit for those that could receive the child payment. On the first point, the challenge is if we were to focus on any alternatives, he'll know that local authorities are very stretched at the moment, government's quite stretched at the moment. So the fear is that if you were to focus on an alternative to fill that gap, then you ultimately delay the rollout of the Scottish Child Payment itself. So we're trying to make sure that the Scottish Child Payment runs to timetable because we know how critical the support will be, particularly coming out of COVID, and we don't want anything to risk that timetable.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alec. No one else has indicated you want to ask a question at this stage. Can I thank, therefore, the Cabinet Secretary for evidence today? We now turn to item 2 on our agenda, which is consideration of the formal motion on the budget provisions. I therefore invite the Minister to move S5M 22834 that the Finance and Constitution Committee recommends that the Budget Scotland Act 2020 Amendment No. 2 regulations be approved.
I move the motion in my name.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'm not seeing that any member at this stage wishes to make any further comments, and that continues to be the case. I therefore now put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S5M 22834 be agreed. Are we all agreed? If we're all agreed, if any member disagrees, can you type N in the chat bar? In which case, I see no disagreement, and therefore the motion is agreed to. Thank you. The committee will publish a report setting out its decisions in the coming days. We previously agreed to take our next item in private, so I now close this public part of the meeting, and members should now log on in our private session in MS Teams. Thank you again, Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks very much.